Hey, shalom, guys. Welcome to another interview special. Today, I have someone very special. His name is Dr. Ryan Mullins. So, he himself has published over 50 essays on various topics in philosophical theology related to models of God, philosophy of time, personal identity, the problem of evil, disability theology, the Trinity, and incarnation. He has published 2 books, The End of the Timeless God and God and Emotion. Dr. Mullins has held research and teaching fellowships at the University of Notre Dame, the College of Cambridge, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Edinburgh, and the University of Helsinki. So please, guys, help me introduce and say hello to Dr. Ryan Mullins. Dude, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
So one thing I do have to say, one thing that everyone probably doesn't know about you is you are kind of a metalhead. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Okay. So I'm curious though, what is your favorite band, and what do you think is the greatest band of all time? Because I know a lot of people will like go back and forth, and I think I have a pretty good case for mine, but I'm curious about yours.
One of my favorite bands is Zayo. So it's this like metalcore band. It started out at like some like tiny little Pentecostal church in Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly. And then now I don't remember how many albums they've put out by now. Like it's a lot. They just had a new one come out, I think this year actually. Yeah, so they're one of my favorite, kind of like constantly go back to.
Okay, and then so for me personally, I love the Police. I'm a big Stuart Copeland fan, especially too. When I was growing up, I loved playing Spyro the Dragon on the PlayStation, and he actually did the whole soundtrack for it. It was actually he won a ton of awards as like the greatest soundtrack for a video game. And I don't know, I love the Police. Play on Guitar Hero 2, you know, when you're in high school, middle school. And then I'm curious about this. I think overall the greatest band of all time is Queen.
Oh, that's I think you could make a good argument for that because they just have so many like top chart hits. Like
yes.
Like, and that was something like when do you remember that movie that came out a few years ago? Like
yes.
Like when it was really good and very moving. And then I had forgotten just the sheer number of hits that they had. But then you're watching it, you know, of course they're like playing all of them. I'm like, it just keeps going. And I'm like, that was a banger. That one was a banger. My gosh. Like, yeah, it's just, I could, yeah, I think that's a good choice.
Because I know too many people will say either the Beatles or Led Zeppelin. I feel like when we look at Queen, Freddie Mercury is the greatest singer and greatest frontman of all time. And you look at every other person there, first of all, they're all geniuses. They're all going to college for PhD level stuff, and they all quit to be rock stars. And like you said, though, from the very beginning, from the very end, they did not stop coming out with hit after hit after hit. And it's like, I love Led Zeppelin, but I feel like they've had some highs and lows. I feel like the Beatles have had some highs and lows. I feel like Queen has always had that dominant performance of everything they've done, even by switching it up. They've always come out. So thank you for not yelling at me, first off, because when I say this, I get yelled and screamed at by people like, oh, you don't know music. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but like I feel like when we look at how they've progressed, they've changed their music, they changed the sound. And you can even make a case for either Bohemian Rhapsody or Stairway to Heaven as like the greatest songs ever, you know, that ever came out. So, but enough about music, though. Everyone's here to hear about your answers to my questions about philosophy. And so let's start this off with, how did you become interested in philosophy and theology?
So when I was in high school, we were reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and there was a chapter on God and time, and that was the first moment I got like really hooked on just this question of like, hang on, how does this work? Like, how exactly does God relate to time? And then I got super obsessed, and then did a PhD in the topic, and then I've got one book already out, another book coming out soon on the topic. So. So that was originally how I got addicted to it, was just this question of exactly how does God relate to time. So I've been like 16.
Okay, was that like a book that you had to read in English class or whatever?
Yeah, it was for English class. So because I went to a Christian high school, and so it was for English class, and I don't know if I actually read the chapter that day, but like when we had because I probably didn't, if I'm being honest, but that day in class we were discussing, I just remember the English teacher getting really upset. She's like, because Lewis says like God's outside of time, and the English teacher, she's like, if that doesn't blow your mind, then you're not really thinking about the question. And I realized, no, I wasn't really thinking about this. This is weird. It's huge. Okay, what does this mean? And then I got just kind of addicted to a lot of philosophical questions from there.
Okay. So then from there, for my next question then, when did you realize that you wanted to like pursue academically and get degrees in philosophy and theology? Like, was it right at that moment or was it more in college and stuff?
It was in college. Like I originally was doing communications because I wanted to go to film school. And so I was doing an undergraduate degree in like television and radio, this kind of stuff. And I was also taking some philosophy and theology classes, which I enjoyed. But I remember the exact day I changed my major. So I was in this terrible class, and someone asked the professor, like, what are we going to be talking about next semester in like communication and ethics class? And the guy goes, you remember that really famous picture from the Vietnam War where there's this little boy that's on fire? And it was like, it won like all these awards and stuff. Like the kid, I think, was lit on fire by like a flamethrower or something. And he goes, we're going to ask ethical questions. Like when you see a child like that, do you get the picture or do you put the kid out? And myself and like everyone else in the class were like, oh, that's a really good question. And then I leave the class and I start walking up the stairs to get out of the building. And I immediately go, that's not a good question. That's a terrible question. You put the kid out. What am I thinking? Like, and I was just furious. I was so angry. So I went right then and there to my supervisor and was like, I'm changing my major. I'm like, this is not, what am I doing with my life? And I want to teach theology and philosophy.
That's hilarious. Yeah. I don't want to say for the child, obviously, but right. that's funny because it makes you think in a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I get the idea because like that picture was very influential in changing a lot of public perception about the Vietnam War, but still, like just the fact that question bothered me for even only probably like 2-3 minutes tops, but still that I was like, oh, that is a real dilemma. And I'm like, no, it's not. No, there's a child on fire in front of you. You put it out. Like, what am I doing with my life? It really was like a moment of going, I am an idiot. I'm wasting my time here.
It's like one of those things where like you're overthinking it. Just do it.
You know. Oh yeah.
I can relate to that in a way because a few years ago, like our basement was flooding and my wife was freaking out. I'm like, dude, grab a bucket. Let's go.
Right.
So I totally get that. So going on in that, this topic I've seen a lot on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube of divine simplicity. So I wanted to ask you, because you are an expert, you are the one with a PhD in philosophy and theology. Like, what is divine simplicity? And also regarding to some of the early church fathers like Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, and I'm pronouncing those names incorrectly, but you know who I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How would they understand it back then, and how do you understand it today?
See, I don't think the definition has changed that much over the years.
Okay.
And this is the thing though, is I get asked this all the time about like different conceptions of divine simplicity. And now that I've studied it more, not just in the Christian tradition, but in like all the different like Western traditions, I'm like, there's such a clear thread here of what this means. There's no such thing as different versions of divine simplicity. I think this is like a modern day myth that certain Christian groups have kind of forced on us. So here's the idea. So all the different models of God, for the most part, agree God is not a composite being. God is not made up of parts. And so a lot of times people, when they affirm simplicity, they'll say, that's what we mean. God's not a composite being. And I'm like, well, that's not enough, because like lots of people who explicitly say divine simplicity is false, like Al-Ghazali, for example, he'll be like, simplicity is false. But of course, God's not made of parts. That's stupid. Who would think God's made of parts? So that's the one claim you need, but it's not going to get you simplicity. The further claim you need is this, what's called the identity thesis, that everything that you predicate of God is identical to God. So all that is intrinsic to God is identical to God. So Augustine has this statement of all that is in God is God. And so it's this identity thesis. So if I say God is good, if I say God is powerful, if I say, anything that seems proper to attribute to God, I have to say all of those things are somehow identical to each other and identical to God. And which is a pretty wild claim. You're going to get, some people will think that there's, with Aquinas or some of these other Aristotelians, they're going to think that there's like some new kind of stuff going on, because they'll say like, oh, well, God doesn't have act or potency. And I'm like, well, they just think those are parts. And so they're still sticking with the claim that God doesn't have parts. They just think there's more things out there that count as parts. So really the core claim is God's not composed of parts, and all that you predicate of God is identical to God, which is pretty radical.
Okay. And I think it's interesting too, because again, I think it's, we talked about this a little earlier before we started the interview, of giving a platform to too many uneducated people, where they will then make claims to it not changing. And I find that interesting. And I'm glad you can clarify that for me and for everyone listening, because it's almost like even the Trinity in a way, where we'll see kind of the early church councils clearly more define what the Trinity is. But even now, like Orthodox will hold a monarchical view of the Trinity, where Catholics don't. Right. And it's almost I don't want to say a word game, but it kind of is.
Sometimes it feels that way. Yeah.
Well, right. And I am glad though you're able to clarify with divine simplicity that it's basically is consistent from the early church fathers even to today.
Yeah, there's different nuances that they'll put in one sense, but it's more of what they think counts as different kinds of distinctions that would count as parts. Right. That's really what it comes down to. So you're not really changing the definition. All you're doing is going, oh, well, this thing over here, that counts as a part. So, that's not going to apply to God. And someone else will go, well, that's not a part. And so that's where I think it gets confusing, is you'll see these kind of debates, but it's still really at rock bottom the same two theses going together to say this is what simplicity is.
Okay, yeah, that is kind of what it does seem like. But again, thank you for clarifying. Definitely. Now, anyone who does watch my channel, I do a lot of Jewish stuff. So my favorite Jewish philosopher is Rambam, or Maimonides. So my question to you, Dr. Ryan Mullins, is what is your opinion of the Jewish philosopher Rambam, and what ideas of his you agree or disagree with, or what has inspired you from him?
Yeah, so I just went through and reread him a few months ago, because it had been a long time since I had really read any of his work. And so it was really fascinating, because I'm interested in this question about the eternity of the world. Like, why should I affirm creation out of nothing instead of like a doctrine of eternal creation? And his discussion in there is really interesting, because he kind of starts out going like, I don't really know. There's some arguments for and against each view. Faith teaches me that I have to affirm, creation out of nothing. But look, I'll still take you through all the arguments. And he does a really good job at that, like of taking you through all these different arguments that from like Aristotle up to like his time period. And it's a really good discussion. I like the honesty of him just kind of going, these arguments for and against, and I don't know quite, like, reason doesn't really push me one way or the other. I appreciate that. And then some of the arguments I just thought were really interesting and really good. And then it leads into this discussion on, can God know the particulars of creation? Which a lot of Christians are not familiar with these debates, because in the Christian tradition, it got answered like right away. Whereas in the Islamic and Jewish tradition, like it's still like an ongoing thing for a very good reason. So does God know what's happening right now? Does God know you and I as like particular beings and not just like ideas in his head? And Aristotle would say like, God can't know that stuff, because then he wouldn't be perfect. And you see this big debate going on in Western history. And when Maimonides weighs in on it, he's like, no, God's got to know the particulars. Otherwise, he's not omniscient. But he doesn't give you a lot of details. And so Gersonides later comes along and goes, yeah, I like Maimonides' answer, but he doesn't explain anything. So it's kind of useless. And he like kind of trashes him a bit and then moves on. And I just thought, I was like, that's kind of funny. Like, because it's kind of true. But like, yeah, you've got these moments where Maimonides, he's like, here's as far as reason can go, as far as I'm concerned. And I just appreciate that honesty.
No, yeah, that's one thing I love about him. Yeah, he's very honest. He'll say, I don't know, or he'll just give a simple reason, to where I feel like even different philosophies or philosophers, excuse me, almost feel like they have to give a reason. They have to come up with something.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes when I read it, it's like, no, I disagree. Like, I disagree with that. And I even wonder to myself, like, how did this concept even become something? How did you get to this? How did you get from A to B? Like, make that make sense.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Because sometimes you'll be reading like different claims and you're like, where on earth did you get this? And why did everyone think this was a good idea for so long? I've had that experience. I don't know how many times when I'm reading through different philosophical ideas.
Yeah, because it's not just anyone necessarily like in the Jewish and in the Christian world. I know that's kind of where I think you and I mostly would like look at. But any type of philosophy, it's how did you get here? It's almost, and I know a lot of it too. I feel like was brought up politically.
Sure, sometimes that happens.
Like,
oh yeah,
where they kind of just have to get this answer just to get political power and stuff like that, which. No bueno, but I appreciate Rambam. He's my favorite. I love the guy.
Yeah, no, he's a good writer. Like his Guide for the Perplexed is a deeply, deeply influential book in Western history, and for a good reason. And so that's what was fascinating to go through and reread that quite recently. Of going, oh, here's all these debates between like Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, and all this stuff going on in the early modern time period. I'm like, they really are just like repeating a lot of the arguments that like Maimonides had like collected and was discussing. So I'm like, man, I can see the influence now.
That's where I see too, where it's like no one's original anymore.
Yeah,
it's like
it's like, hard to be.
He said this, so that's just what we're gonna go with. And I feel like that even happens too much in the Jewish and the Christian sects of what they believe and why they believe. Well, Rashi said it. Oh, Nachmanides said this. Oh, Rabbi Eliezer said this. Or they'll look at church fathers. Athenagoras said this. Origen said this. So that's what we go with,
They're like, must be right. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Whereas Maimonides is like, no, here's the arguments. Consider them. And I'd appreciate any time a philosopher or a theologian does that. They're like, I don't know, but here's the arguments. Let's go through these.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, yeah, thank you for that. Now, staying on the subject of Rambam, concerning Isaiah 53, and I know this is a super big topic. Rashi here gives his interpretation of Isaiah 53 being about Israel. But it's interesting because Rambam says, no, he's wrong. It's about Mashiach, the Messiah, right? So my question then is, and I think everyone knows where you're going to kind of go with this. Who do you think it's about? Do you also then believe it could be a typology where it could be about Israel or even Isaiah himself, but a typology of Jesus or the Messiah?
Yeah, so this is a question I've not thought about since seminary. So we're going quite a ways back now. And I find the idea of it being a typology, like it being both about something in that immediate context and it being a typology that the Messiah would fulfill. Like I find that very plausible. Now, in the immediate context of when it's written, who is it referring to? I don't know, man. Because like I'd see some of these debates saying it's got to be the king, or maybe it's like Israel as a whole personified, or maybe it's the prophet. And I'm like, man, I don't know. These are good arguments either way. But the way a lot of biblical prophecy works is a big element of it is supposed to be something in the immediate future that would mean something to that audience. But which is it? Is it the king? Is it Israel personified? Is it the king being personified to represent all of Israel? Man, I don't know. You're going to have to ask like an Old Testament scholar on that kind of stuff. But something like the idea of it being a typology, though, that you would see Christ fulfilling later on, that seems very plausible to me. Yeah.
Right. Because I know the whole excerpt 53 is you have to go back and read 48 to 55.
Right.
And part of the argument is, well, it's then addressing it as Israel, and therefore it must be Israel. But then it's talking about a solo, independent, singular person.
Right.
Which then the argument can be made, well, it's talking about Isaiah, because even in the Talmud, it talks about how Isaiah is killed, which then Tertullian, Justin Martyr, and Josephus, they even bring up of how Isaiah died, for hiding in a tree, and then it was like cut in half. That's how he ultimately died. But then when you go into more of the specifics of 53 for like atoning for the sins and stuff like that, it's then like, okay, well then this has to be a Mashiach figure,
right?
you know. So that's I kind of lean more towards a typology, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, it is Christ. I mean, even when we read the New Testament, even when he says, for you have read what was written about me,
Mm-hmm.
not just the Torah, but the entire Tanakh, arguably is all about Mashiach.
Yeah, so I think that's why I like the idea of it being some kind of typology where you can go, this is talking again about something in the immediate context, but it's really foreshadowing of like God does have this bigger plan that's going somewhere, and when it all comes together, it's gonna blow your mind. You're not gonna like you're gonna be like, how did we not see this coming? But also, how could I have seen this coming? My gosh, there's so many twists and turns and like, yeah. So like, yeah. So I think so I quite like the idea of it being a typology. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Just so I'm not alone. Just so I
Mhm.
don't, my Christian friends don't attack me, and my Jewish friends, they're like, it's a typology. It's both.
Yeah.
Just to
Yeah.
make everyone happy. Okay, so the next, kind of going with that for the atonement,
Mhm.
is there's 7 main atonement theories, and I know this is one topic that is super everyone is talking about right now. But like, what is atonement, and how does Jesus atone for our sins? And within the atonement theory whole thing, is there one specifically that you gravitate more towards, or is there one that you assert?
See, this is one of the areas in Christian theology that I don't have a good answer for. I don't like any of the existent theories of the atonement. I don't think that any of them really capture everything that needs to be addressed from Scripture and from what we know about human nature. Uh, and some of the theories I think are either incoherent or they go against some kind of biblical data, or they're just I don't know, it's just kind of nuts. And so I'm like, why should I think that? So I actually really struggle with this because I don't like any, like I said, I don't really like any of the theories too much. So some of the stuff you need to account for with atonement is the English word atonement it was invented to try to capture what's going on in Scripture. So it's supposed to be at one meant. And whatever that process is that makes us at one with God and with each other, I think and I emphasize the with each other too, because that's what I think gets typically ignored. When we're typically looking at theories of salvation or atonement, we're trying to figure out like, so God's upset or his honor's been disrespected, and we need to figure out what exactly needs to be done for God to forgive us. And I don't think that really captures the full project that God is up to, because I think what God wants from humanity is he wants us to become the kind of beings that he could call friends. And that involves us also being in a good relationship with each other. And I don't see a lot of these theories handling that. So if you say, for example, Christ was punished for our sins, so he took the punishment for us. And so God's able to go, okay, someone was punished. There we go. I'm satisfied. And I'll forgive you. And I'm like, cool. Well, now what? Because the world still kind of sucks. I still hate that guy over there because he wronged me in a bunch of ways. How is God reconciling the world to himself through Christ? I feel like there's a lot left open there. And then another element of it, this is one you see, Marilyn Adams talked about this a little bit. It's not just that like God's upset with us for sinning, because that one's obvious. Like, right, like, we've done a lot of terrible things. It's also the case that humanity is upset with God because we find ourselves in a world we didn't ask to be born. We find ourselves in this world, and we're being asked to participate in this project of creation without. God couldn't ask us to. There's no way you could get our consent ahead of time. Be like, hey Ryan, can I create you and put you in this? You can't do that. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
But there might be some anger that comes with that. And so you've got to also deal with that in too, of going, okay, how is God going to reconcile humanity to himself when when God's like, you guys have really screwed up. And then some people are also going, yeah, well, you screwed up too. I don't think God actually did screw up, but I definitely have said that before. And you see the Old Testament prophets sometimes going, God, like, what you doing? And God addresses it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to have a theory that addresses a lot of these different kinds of concerns. And I don't really see a good theory of atonement doing that. And that bothers me as a theologian.
Okay, good, because I 110% agree with that. I agree with you on the penalty part. So PSA I do think is incorrect. I know a lot of my Protestant and Reformation friends, they hold that view.
Mhm.
I'm kind of in a weird boat of I think I agree like partially. And again, because I agree with you, no atonement theory I think really answers and satisfies the question. So I'm kind of like Christus Victus. Okay, I kind of see like 80% of it there. I'm not all the way.
Mhm.
Or scapegoat theory. I
Mhm.
kind of agree with that. Or the ransom
Mhm.
theory. I'm like, yes, but to full for me to say I fully agree with this and I will work with this. No, but I'm like those three in particular. I feel like me personally, I kind of gravitate
Mhm.
the most towards. But again, I'm like you. I don't like any of them. But again, I don't have a degree. You do. I'm glad that I can say I don't agree with one, and because someone will then say, "Well, Will, you're not educated." And I'm like, right. But watch my interview with Dr. Ryan Mullins because he also isn't satisfied with any of them either. So I'm definitely not alone.
Yeah, but this is not my main area of expertise. So, I can be like, I've got two PhDs and I don't like these theories, but I'm also not an expert on them. So take it with a grain of salt. But it is common, though, for a lot of different people working on the atonement to say all these different theories are trying to capture something. And then they'll try to develop these new arguments for which one's more fundamental than the others, or trying to figure out how exactly do I fit all this patchwork of theories together. So there's a lot of people who are experts on this going, something's missing, something's not quite right. We need to come up with something better. So it's a common theme you see in a lot of contemporary theology.
And I think too, it's interesting because even with the atonement of Jesus, I don't think we will ever fully understand it. And I think that's okay with us, even as believers, as Christians. Because, for instance, one of the Torah portions, it was talking about, when a woman gives birth, she has to bring a sin offering to the priest.
Mm,
Well, that's kind of contradictory because within the Torah, this is something that she must do. But what sin did she create? What sin
right.
did she do by giving birth?
Hmm.
That's a commandment. Now,
Yeah.
again, all of the you'll get all types of reasons on why this happens, but it is never explained. And honestly, I feel like with this, every reason that is given, it's like I can kind of see it, but it really doesn't still make sense because
Hmm.
a child is coming in, or because there was blood with the birth, so the blood has to be the atonement. It's like, yeah, but what was the sin? Because it is a sin offering that needs to be presented. So I feel like this will all be explained to us when
Hmm.
Jesus does return. He will be able
Yeah.
to explain the Torah to us and the entire Bible, make everything make sense. But until then, I think it's perfectly fine by saying we don't know, and that's okay.
Yeah, I do think that it took me a long time to get to that point because lacking a theory of the atonement, that was something in my adult life, at least, that really bothered me. That was a struggle of faith of going, I don't know how to make sense of this, and this is pretty central to Christianity. But the idea of having faith in God is you're placing trust in certain promises. And so the things that I could see clearly of going, there's this promise, it's made clear to me that you have been forgiven. It's made clear to me that death is a very serious problem you want to avoid. You don't, and damnation you don't want that. And Jesus is going to resurrect you in the same way that the Father resurrected Christ. He's going to resurrect you.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, these parts are at least clear to me, and that's enough for me to continue to place my trust in God. Whereas I don't understand all the other mechanisms of what's going on here, but I know that much, and so this is enough for me to go, yes, this is a trustworthy being.
Right. All right, perfect. Thank you. Now, the next one is kind of referring to atheists. And I
Mhm.
feel like that atheists present kind of the best arguments to a lot of Christians. When you really find some good atheists who actually want to have an honest conversation, they tend to bring up like the best questions with how stuff is. And just as we were talking about, I feel like we can't always. It's like explaining God to something, right?
Mhm.
It's almost impossible. But addressing atheists with the quality of God being all knowing, yet we have free will. Does this
Mhm.
contradict with God allowing us to make free decisions?
I don't think it's obvious. Like there's a sense in which when you see, okay, well, first we should clarify a little something else. You could say God knows everything, and then you could also say there's nothing to know about the future. There just are no facts about what will happen. There's a lot of facts about what could happen or what might happen, and God can know all those. But if there's no settled timeline that describes exactly how, in fact, the future will unfold, then God would still know all the facts. He'd still be omniscient. And that seems perfectly consistent with having free will, because God's like, I know everything. What exactly are you going to do? There's no fact of the matter. There's nothing there to know. What will you probably do? Oh, I know that much. So you still would know everything. What you're interested in, though, is like if God, like if there is in fact a settled timeline about how the future will unfold. God knows all of that. Do I have free will if God knows the future? Right? Like that's, yeah. And that's the part where the arguments for saying you do not have free will, I think they're incomplete in a certain sense. They'll get you to this sort of statement of, I find myself in this world, and there's a future set of actions that I am going to perform, and there's nothing I can do right now to change that. And that's enough to make you kind of feel very uncomfortable. And I think you should feel uncomfortable. But that in and of itself doesn't really explain, why exactly am I going to do those actions? Is it because I think that's just the most reasonable thing to do? If so, then what's wrong? Why don't I have free will? So you got to have more to the story there. And I've talked to some different open theist philosophers like Patrick Todd in Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh. And he says this is actually something that he bothers him, because he thinks that the standard freedom for knowledge problem, it doesn't really explain exactly in crystal clear way why you do not have free will. So there has to be more to the story. And I think that's right. But what exactly that more to the story is, I don't know. I got nothing.
Yeah, because I almost feel like, I have kids. I have a 4-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl. And, I'll talk to my wife sometimes of like, all right, my son's name is Elijah. And I'll say, Eli, don't do this. And like, I'll look at my wife and I'll say, he's going to do it. I know he is. He's gonna do it. Now, I feel like that's the same thing with God, where God will know what we're going to do, but we still, even though he knows what we're going to do, we still have that free choice, but he just knows what we're going to do. But we're still in full control of deciding this. Like, just because he knows it doesn't mean he's like forcing us to do it. I feel like that's one of the atheist arguments. Well, they'll almost twist it and like, well, he knows what you're going to do because he's forcing you to do it. No, I feel like he knows what we're going to do, but he's still not forcing. He just knows what will happen.
Yeah. And this is where it's not like they're mischaracterizing the position, because you can easily find major thinkers in the Western world who do say, well, God has to cause everything that happens. And so you're like, okay, so he causes me to exist. And you're like, yeah. And like, what else? Well, you have thoughts. Yeah. Well, God causes those. And I'm like, he causes my thoughts? Yeah. Your desires, he causes my actions? Yeah. He causes all of it. I'm like, what? Okay. That does sound like he's forcing me. And they're like, no, he's not forcing you. I'm like, I only did the thing that I did because God caused me to do it.
Right.
That feels like force. And so when atheists are like focused, they could easily bring up those kind of positions and go, these are real positions that people did affirm and still do affirm today. So I can at least say, well, they're accurately arguing against these views, but those are not all the views. Those are not all the options on the table.
Right. Yeah. I feel, when you come up with the position of God's forcing you to do it in that aspect, they have a point, I feel like, but I feel like that's also being disingenuous and misrepresenting who God is and how it works.
I think so, but when you look at say St. Augustine, when we mentioned him earlier, in his earlier works, it's freedom all the way. Like he's like real big fan of freedom. And then and in some of his later works, his book called The Retractions, where he's retracting lots of things and revising a lot of his views. It really does look like God's just directly causing everything you're doing. And I'm like, okay, so like that's just one of many examples you could give of going, man, okay, there really was a major thinker, a Christian thinker, who did say this kind of stuff. And so the atheist, I think, you'd be like, yep, you can argue against Augustine, but I disagree with Augustine. I like his earlier work where he didn't say these things.
No, yeah, that makes sense. So within that, with the Bible and God, I want to now look at like the morality of everything. So how does
Mhm.
the Bible define what is morality, and do we need God to define morality, or can we define it?
It depends what sense, like, so if we're defining, you could just say we're just trying to discern or discover exactly what is right and wrong. So in the
Mhm.
same way that I'm not inventing math when I discover that 2 + 2 = 4. So I want to make sure that like no one thinks that when I say like, yeah, we define morality as, I'm not saying like we're deciding what's right. We're trying to figure it out. We're trying to discover it. And I think that what you see in the Old Testament, there's a lot of different things that help you get a grasp on trying to point out different facets of the moral landscape, trying to point out this is what a good person would do. This is like a virtuous thing. This is a vicious thing. So in the New Testament, you get these are the fruits of the Spirit. And it's kind of like a list of virtues. So we can be like, okay, so those are things I should cultivate. I should try to be like that. And there's also other kinds of actions that I should not perform because they're just wrong, full stop. And other sort of actions that I should do sometimes, but not always. Depends on the context. There's a time and place for lots of different kinds of things.
Mhm.
Ecclesiastes says that. Here's a very important theme that some people, like Drew Johnson, for example, will say this is at the heart of the moral philosophy of the Hebrew Bible: empathy and compassion. So this cluster of things of empathy, compassion, and mercy, these are like really core concepts in Hebraic philosophy that you can start to develop in lots of different ways and try to start, theorizing and all that. But those are like core claims, which I think is fascinating because you see a lot of emphasis on mercy and compassion and empathy in the Hebrew Bible. And then you see a huge emphasis on God being merciful and compassionate and empathetic. So I'm like, okay, these do seem like these are very, very core, important moral claims. Now, what do you do with that? When I think about what empathy and compassion are, empathy is coming to realize this is what it's like for this other person to think and feel and act in the way that they do.
Mhm.
That's it. I come to know this is what it's like to be you, or you come to see things from my perspective. You do not lose your own perspective when you do this, because if you lost your own perspective, you'd be failing to empathize with me. You'd be like confusing yourself with me, and that's just some kind of cognitive failure. They wouldn't be empathizing.
Right.
Now, compassion is a particular kind of response on the basis of empathy. It's like when I empathize with you, and because I've empathized with you and I've learned certain things, I'm now motivated to act benevolently for you, or do something on your behalf that's good for you. That's not the only response to empathy. Like I might like empathize with you and be like, "You are a horrible human being, Mike. This is how you see the world." No, the judgment all the way. That's all fine too. So what I see in empathy is giving you a grasp of certain moral truths that you might not, you would not be able to see otherwise. And because you're able to empathize with people, you're better able to be a moral judge. And so if God is perfect in empathy, then God's going to be the perfect moral judge.
Mhm.
So I think empathy and compassion and mercy are very important, but I don't think it's going to give you like a full moral philosophy. But I think it's going to help you identify things that are important in the world that are right and wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a really good answer. Thank you. I thank you for that. I was not expecting that. I was kind of blown away by that. So I know part of the reason for the question is I know there's a lot of kind of smaller Christian sects, Hebrew roots and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that, where they'll look at the morality of the Old Testament about like eating pork or something,
Sure.
or you're
Yeah.
not wearing the tzitzits,
Mm-hmm.
and because you're not doing this, then you're like morally bad,
Mm-hmm.
and it's then you're like condemned to like you should be basically killed, or because
Right.
what you're doing is so bad. And it's I'll have to kind of talk to them like, well, what's the punishment of eating unclean? You can't enter the temple, right? But it's still the same law of if you kill someone, like you're held to capital murder. There's a punishment for that, and we even see this in the New Testament. Um, so how how do we kind of differ those from what we see today with like Christians? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember one of my New Testament professors in undergrad saying, "What you see repeated in the New Testament, like that's a good gut like rule of thumb to figure out does this carry over for Christians? I mean, that one's really obvious. So if Jesus is like, if the Old Testament's like, yeah, don't murder, like just stop that. And then you see Jesus going, yeah, that really, you really shouldn't be doing that. And you're like, okay, murder's wrong. What about like, eating some pork or eating, some stuff with like, that's got like cloven hooves and all that. Is that like, what about that? And then you see God going like, yeah, no, it's all fine now in the New Testament. And you're like, okay, there's some kind of distinction here going on in the Old Testament between things that are like morally right and wrong and things that would be legally or ceremonial right and wrong. And in a lot of contemporary moral philosophy, we'll say, yeah, there's different kinds of rights and wrongs, not all of which are moral. Some things are just purely legal. Some things, it's just like, it's not like you should like it's morally wrong to do, but it just wouldn't make any sense. So like when you're doing your plumbing, there's a lot of, it's not like it'd be morally wrong to do like certain kinds of techniques, but it just wouldn't make any sense to do it. You're like, no, this is the most efficient way to fix these pipes here. Like,
right.
And so it's not a moral ought. It's more of a, do you want to be stupid or do you want to be smart about this? And trying to figure out what's going on in a lot of the Old Testament law, where all these things fit, is a mess. But I think one good like rule of thumb is, does Jesus repeat it? Okay, cool. If not, then
it's an important one, obviously.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, because even with us in the States, we have felonies, and different even felonies. There's I don't know which one's higher, lower, whatever. There's a felony 1, and then there's a felony 5. I think 1 is the worst, and 5 is like the least amount. Like I think if you steal if you theft whatever, $1,000 or more, I think it's like a felony 5. And of course, every state is different, but a felony 1 would be a higher degree. And I think us as Christians coming into it, we should be more focused. Not saying that anything like a felony 5 or something like that would be okay in any way, shape, or form. But I feel like Jesus here was focusing more on the serious matters. Because even when he gives us the Sermon on the Mount, he's like, if you've heard, don't commit murder. But if you hate your brother, you've committed murder. Or like murder is a serious crime. Or even adultery. Even now in the States, you can get divorced for adultery. If you look at another woman with lust, you've committed adultery. Like he focuses on, like you've said, like those major ones that serious consequences can happen. And it seems like these are the ones that we need to seriously look at first before focusing on the small stuff.
Yeah, so when you're looking at the cases you bring up, I think two things. One, yeah, you're right, because he brings up these things that are very serious. So he's like, it'd be better if you tied a stone around your neck and threw yourself into the sea than hurt these children. And you're like, right, yeah, okay, I get that. I get why you'd make a strong claim like that, because harming children is very, very wrong. But when you're looking at like some of these lust cases, you're like, well, surely it's not like checking someone out is not as bad as like actually doing the deed. What's going on here, Jesus? And I think what's going on there is he's like, you need to be checking your heart as well. Like there's a lot of things, it's because it's not just the action itself. That's like, I personally want to say yes, like committing an act of adultery is worse than just thinking about it. But there's something about the purity of your soul and going, how are you viewing other people? Are you viewing them as just objects to be used? Or are you really looking at them as, these are people made in the image of God that deserve respect? And so I think what Jesus is trying to get at in some of these teachings is you need to start viewing people in a particular way that you are not doing right now. And so it's really trying to transform people from the inside out instead of just looking at the actions, really looking at their heart.
Right. Basically being an imitator of God, how God views us. That's how we should view these people.
Yes.
And I'm glad you said that, like not viewing people as inanimate objects, as like either a slave or anything like that. This is a human being whom God has created, who has a special purpose in life.
Yeah. Because if you start seeing people that way and you really believe it, because this is always the hard part for us as humans is, we can know something's true, but that still doesn't mean we embody it and really have it deeply important in our minds. But if you really do start to see people in this way, that changes a lot of your thought processes. It really changes a lot of your actions.
Right. Now, of course, one of the actions that the Bible does talk about is what happens, if you're good or if you're bad. And one of the things I've seen, again, a lot on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything like that, is the discussion of hell. So concerning hell, how is it academically defined? And within the New Testament, within the Greek, we see 3 different words that are all translated as hell, but all play different roles. Of course, the words being Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus. So how would you academically define them, and kind of what are the differences between those 3 places?
Those 3 places, gosh, the debates are weird. So like Tartarus is like, when you're looking at a lot of the Second Temple literature, and so like the Apocrypha, like so like the Book of Enoch, for instance, which is weird and wild, and that's one of the reasons I love it. Is that's a place where like the fallen angels go. So like that's their place. That's so you and I don't have to worry about going there because we're not fallen angels, which is great because it sounds like it's pretty terrible. So I'm glad I don't have to go there. Whereas like Gehenna and Hades, you get these different kinds of discussions. Sometimes it's like, well, that's just like it's like this burning like garbage dump over here. So like that's what it's referring to. You're like, yeah, but is that like evoking some kind of actual like understanding of the afterlife? And some people will say yes, some people will say no. I've seen people talk about Hades in terms of a very like vibrant kind of vision of the afterlife where there's like punishments or rewards, or it's a waiting place. And I've also seen people describe it as sort of like a filing cabinet for souls. Like all the souls just get kind of put in this filing cabinet until resurrection. Are they even aware they're in the filing cabinet? No. So I've seen all these different kinds of debates on those 3 things in academic literature. So it's messy. Whereas when it comes to like actual like theories of hell, the main kind of views are hell is eternal conscious torment. Or it's a place where you go for a little bit so God can let you know you really suck, and now I'm going to annihilate you, but I need you to know that you suck before I annihilate you. And you're like, okay. And then others will go, no, God just annihilates you as soon as you die. Like there's no reason to like let these people carry on. So those are some views you'll see on hell. And then you'll see another view too, where you go to hell. It's not great, but you still have the opportunity to get out. So it's not like you're just fully trapped in there forever. Like you really do have, it's a place more of punishment, sure, but the punishment has the goal of reformation or redemption. So it's possible for you to get out and then enter into God's kingdom. So these are some of the kind of views you'll see in a lot of the academic literature. So it's kind of messy, but that's academic stuff. It's often messy.
Yeah, because I know where you're talking about like you go to hell and then you can get out basically.
Mm-hmm.
Concerning like the 3 branches, you have Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. Catholics, they have the purgatory. Eastern Orthodox, they have the toll houses. Which, with my discussions a lot with the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics, is basically the same thing. Like you have to go there to burn a little bit, and then you get out. But then it's interesting because like Protestantism, it's like they completely reject any type of idea like that.
I know, and I don't understand the full history here. So Jerry Walls, he's written 4 books on this. Like one was Heaven, Hell, Purgatory, and then he wrote a 4th book that tried to kind of like summarize all those 3 that he had just done. And he was really interested in like a lot of these like purgatorial ideas. He thought, why do we have to reject these as Protestant? There's some Protestants who think this way. And I don't understand the full history of how eventually we came to be where we are now, where most Protestants just go, nah, that's not right. I don't understand how we got here. I don't know the history of it very well, but it does seem like the Protestants typically do go, I don't like that. That sounds too Catholic.
Because I think it's, and I'm not too familiar with this. I believe like in the apocryphal writing of, I think like Tobit or something, or one of the other ones, it gives a greater detail. But, at the Protestant Reformation, a lot of the apocrypha was completely taken out. So now it's not viewed as scripture. But I think it's like somewhere in Corinthians, they'll still make an argument where it's like, I kind of see that. But, it is interesting, though, because I know Protestantism is newer. It's only about 500 years old. And then, when we look at Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, they all claim to be the original church.
Right.
It is interesting where the original, they hold to a type of something before hell or, eternal torment.
Yeah.
When it's more of like I don't want to say new age, but like the newer, they don't. That is interesting.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know?
it's weird. So you'll still see a lot of Protestants very happy to affirm that there's an intermediate state, like a place you go while you're waiting for the final resurrection. Like that's still very popular in the Protestant traditions. But like second chances after death, those became really controversial, and I don't get it. Also, it's interesting you brought up like about the Apocrypha not being in a lot of Protestant traditions. It was sometime, I can't remember if it's right before or right after World War II, is when you start seeing the Apocrypha removed from English Bibles in the Protestant world. So it's
Mm.
only like quite recently. Whereas like like you and I growing up, that you just wouldn't have that in your Bible. Maybe like your Catholic friends would have this extra set of stuff. And you're like, what's going on there? But yeah, it used to be very common in a lot of English traditions to just have the Apocrypha there anyway, even though they were never really held as like that, like didn't have a lot of authority, but they still held them.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know it was only what World War II. So what, 80 years ago?
Yeah, it's like quite recent. Like I just remember,
Wow.
like yeah, first time I hearing that, just being shocked, as I think it lasted a bit longer in England than it did in America, um, if I remember correctly. But yeah, you have to like Google that to fact check me on this. But yeah, it's
Oh yeah,
it's it's
yeah.
more recent than you'd expect, and it's surprising. But yeah.
Okay, wow, that's interesting. Okay, I didn't know that. And then last question for today.
Mhm.
James chapter 4, verse 8, where it says, draw close to God and he will draw close to you. But how can we as believers do that? How can we draw close to God?
Yeah, so this is something I put a lot of thought into in my little book about a big God, which just came out. Uh, and so, what I try to lay out in the introduction is what that looks like to be close to someone. So, if you want to be close to someone, you need to be able to get inside their head a little bit. You need to know what is their basic character, what is their emotional profile, what are the things that they care about, this other person care about, what are their cares and concerns, what are their projects, and what are their goals. And so, if you want to draw close to someone, you need to know those things about them, and then you also need to figure out how do you support their projects and goals. Do you start to care about the same things that they care about? And so if you want to be close to God, you need to know a little bit about what God is like. And you're never going to like fully know everything about God. Same thing as I'm never going to fully know everything about you or my wife or kids or whoever. But you're trying to learn as best as you can what God is like, and then figure out what God's goals are and what God cares about. And then how do I participate in those goals? So if one of God's goals is to try to enter into friendship with humanity, that through Jesus Christ, he's trying to offer this friendship that the Son and the Father had before creation, and to extend that to us. Well, now I got to figure out, how do I support that project? How do I participate in that project? And that's part of the process of growing closer to God.
That's awesome, because right when you said that, the verse that immediately came to my head was John 17:21, where Father, let them be one in us, just as I am in you. Let them, like, he's almost inviting us to
Mm-hmm.
be with him. And I, whenever I hear Christians talking about, John 10:30, the Father and I are one, and then you then read John 17:21, Father, let them be one, just as you and I are one. It's like, wow, like Christ here, this man, he is one with God, with Yahweh, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and he is now inviting us to be a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. That's
Yeah,
really,
it's remarkable, and that's something that really struck me, and so that's why I put it in the introduction to the little book about a big God, was because I thought I don't really see this emphasized quite as much as I would like in theology. And if I start thinking in terms of what exactly are God's goals for this whole project of creation, my goodness, that really changes the way I start to view a lot of different areas of theology, and it really starts to change the way I think about how do I draw closer to God. Well, if that's God's goal, just the way I try to support anybody else and draw close to them, I need to support their goals. The way I need to support this goal too. So it helped me kind of, in a more down to earth sort of way, understand what does it really mean to draw closer to God.
I love that. And what Ryan here is talking about, guys, I have the book with me right here, Eternal in Love. I just got this yesterday, so I have not had a chance to read this, but guys, I'm going to pull this up real quick. Where is it? There it is. All right. So we can see right here, you can go on Amazon, Eternal in Love. You can subscribe to Dr. Ryan Mullins. I think it's your handle on here is RT Mullins, I believe, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so you can go ahead and subscribe to this. Go ahead and check this book out. Please read this. All of Ryan's books are great. I was just actually talking to Ryan before we started this, and I am not a big guy on philosophy, and I tend to almost not hate it, but get annoyed of it because of how a lot of people talk about it. But here, Ryan, breaks this down in such an easy way. I'm excited to read this, and Brian, I'm going to bring you back up in a few months when I get a chance to fully read this. And Ryan will be back on here to answer some of my questions referring to this book. But before we end today, is there anything specific you want to say about this?
Yeah. So when I do a lot of academic writing, there's a certain style that they force you to do that kind of takes out the humanity of you. So being able to tell jokes, being able to just say, I don't actually know the answer to this question, but I'll explain to you why I don't know the answer. You're not allowed to do that sort of stuff. You're not allowed to tell jokes. You're not allowed to be that devotional either. Whereas in this book, the publisher was like, yeah, be R.T. Mullins, be like you and write this. And so it's got a lot of moments of like very deep sarcasm that a lot of the earlier readers of it just were like, this is hilarious. I love this. And then there's a lot of moments of emotion, like deep emotional and spiritual insights that people were like, okay, this is great. And then it's philosophically rigorous, but it's accessible. So I had a lot of people who are not professional theologians or philosophers read this to make sure that that anybody could pick this up and try to understand at least most of what's going on. And so a lot of people said they were able to follow it pretty well. So will you be able to understand everything? Probably not. But will you be able to get most of it? I hope so. At least that's unless everybody was lying to me, which is quite possible. Because sometimes that happens. Like, oh, it was a great book. It's a great book. Did you read it? It was a great book. Yeah. Yeah.
What's your favorite part of it?
Like, I like its cover. It's got very nice covers, Yeah, but no, people were giving me specific examples of parts they liked. So at least the people are giving me feedback. I'm like, okay, you did read this, so that's good. Yeah.
And seriously, that's one thing I appreciate about you is I don't have a degree or anything like that. I just have a library card and with a credit card and access to Amazon. That's my trinity. And that's how I am able to learn everything like this. So especially, and I feel like there's a lot of books out there that suck. I've had to read a lot of books that just aren't good. There's no substance there. But I've read a lot of your articles and I really love what you have to say. And with this, I'm super excited to check this out. So yes, you will be definitely returning to the channel to do a book interview with this. I'm excited. So, well, that's all the questions I have. Dr. Ryan Mullins, dude, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for asking my questions. Thanks for just participating. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to make this happen. I know we're talking about this and you're super busy. So for you to fit this in, I appreciate it very, very, very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on. This is always good to be able to talk to people about these things. It lets me know that I'm not going crazy because a lot of times I'm just sitting in my room reading and thinking, and to know that it actually means something to other people, that means a lot to me.
No, yeah, you are absolutely appreciated. So, guys, please go ahead and check out Eternal in Love. Leave him a review on Amazon, and you will be back on. So, with that being said, shalom, my homies.